Mr. Perez, thank you for contacting me last week from Puerto Rico and your prompt response to the concerns that had been expressed about abuse by law enforcement authorities on that island. And I hope we can continue to work together to make sure that if there are problems, that they are investigated thoroughly and acted upon to change the policy. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Last week, I held a hearing in the Subcommittee on Constitution, Civil Rights, and Human Rights about the new state laws that have been passed in 7 or 8 jurisdictions. They have raised concerns. I sense the concerns personally, but they've raised concerns because they establish new requirements to vote. Voter identification cards, photo IDs in some states, new standards for voter registration in other states, and reducing the period of early voting in many states. It troubles me because when it comes to early voting, in the last election, 30% of Americans felt that was the best way to exercise their right to vote. And as we reduce access to early voting, it creates a hardship on those and many others. Some of the reduction of early voting also raises political questions in my mind. It appears that there has been a concerted effort by some groups to reduce early voting on the Sunday before the election. In Illinois, that is a day when many African-American churches finish their services and people go to vote. The same thing is true in the Hispanic community. And I don't think it's a coincidence that they are arguing that we should close down voting on Sunday. I think there are political motives behind that. The new voter registration law in the state of California is so onerous that the League of Women Voters has publicly announced that it is pulling out of voter registration in that state. Pardon me? Florida. In Florida, I'm sorry. In Florida, that has happened. And if I recall the testimony we received, if you should ask a person to register to vote in Florida under the new law and do not submit the paperwork within 48 hours, you can be fined $1,000. Naturally, the volunteers of the League of Women Voters aren't interested in facing that penalty and have backed away from their traditional historic role of nonpartisan voter registration. The requirements on voter IDs are equally troubling to me. In many states, there are thousands, in some cases hundreds of thousands of eligible voters who don't qualify under the current new law to vote in the next election. They don't have the appropriate voter ID. For example, I was in Tennessee yesterday, in Nashville, and in that state, I believe the number is 126,000 current driver's license holders in that state don't have a driver's license with a photo on it. So if they present that driver's license to vote, they can't under the new Tennessee law. There are over 200,000 people in the state of Wisconsin under their new law who would run into problems in voting. And for those who say, well, they've got time to get a new voter ID card or a new identification card, it turns out there is only one DMV facility in the state of Wisconsin that is open on weekends. One, with over 200,000 people who are going to need some new form of ID. And Mr. Chairman, I ask consent to, at this point, enter into the record a memorandum from one of the DMV offices in Wisconsin where it's an internal memorandum given to the employees to address this issue about people now showing up looking for these new identification cards so they can vote. And they made a point under their law to say it's a free ID card. Otherwise, they might face the charge of a poll tax, that if you have to buy an ID to vote, it could violate some of our basic principles and laws. But in this memo, internal memo from the Wisconsin DMV, there's a statement here which is highlighted, which says to the employees, while you should certainly help customers who come in asking for a free ID to check the appropriate box, you should refrain from offering the free version to customers who don't ask for it. It's an indication to me that the spirit of this is not to make it easier for people, but to make it more difficult for them to vote. I can't think of a worse development in a democracy than making it more difficult for people to vote. At the end of the hearing, reporters and others came up to me and said, "What's next?" And I said, "What's next is the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice." I'd like to ask you, and the question came up in the hearing, why this is happening. And I asked if there was evidence of increased voter fraud and the impersonation of voters, which is what the photo ID is all about. One of the witnesses who was trying to defend these laws said, well, they're really not worth prosecuting, these voter fraud cases. And very difficult to prosecute. The witnesses aren't around. It happened in the polling place. Things come and go and so forth. And it struck me as unusual that we are setting out to change the voting rights of millions of Americans over something that even a supporter has said hasn't warranted prosecution. Can you tell me whether there has been an increased incidence of voter fraud over the last several years, particularly the impersonation of voters, that might give rise to this growing political concern?
Well, the why question, Senator, is in essence, in our analysis, one of the $64,000 questions that we have to answer. Because if you are analyzing a submission to determine whether there was discriminatory purpose, that's really the why question. And so in the work that we are doing now in connection with those, a number of submissions, that's a question, whether it's a voter ID submission or whether you're changing the location of a precinct or whether you're doing any voter change subject to Section 5, that why question is very much animates the work that we do in connection with this. In the Supreme Court case, the Indiana case, there was evidence in that matter, if I recall correctly, of fraud in a 2003 mayoral election. I think it was in Gary. And the court said, and there was no other evidence of that, but the court noted that that was enough in that particular matter to justify what was put in place. So, I mean, we will follow the facts where the facts lead us. We will obviously be guided by the Supreme Court's decision in the Indiana case, and we will undoubtedly be looking at the why question, because the why question very much animates a lot of our work, really whether it's Section 5 or Section 2, because if there's a discriminatory purpose that underlies an action in any state, regardless of whether you're one of the 16, then that's obviously a fact of relevance.